Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Kriti Mehta. You're watching a Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. Now, today we turn to Japan, a country facing major decisions at home and abroad after a snap election that has handed its leadership unprecedented power. Japan's new Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has secured a two-thirds supermajority for the Liberal Democratic Party, the strongest mandate the party has seen in decades. The result comes at a moment of economic pressure, regional security tensions, and a growing debate about Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific. Joining me from Shizuoka, Japan is Dr. Seijiro Takeshita, Professor of Management and Information at the University of Shizuoka, a former dean and veteran of global investment banking with decades of experience in Tokyo, New York, and London. Thank you, Dr. Seijiro Takeshita, for joining us. Let's start with the first question. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has called a snap election shortly after taking office and secured two-thirds supermajority in the lower house, which is the largest mandate the Liberal Democratic Party has held in decades. Now, with the opposition fragmented and weakened, she now has significant legislative freedom. Does this result represent a genuine public endorsement of structural change, including constitutional revision and defense expansion, or is it more of a reflection of opposition disarray than ideological realignment?
Well, actually, I'd say it's both. Firstly, of course, one of the main agenda that Ms. Takaichi and her regime will be working on will be changing constitution, like you say, partly because of this very severe aggression that we're facing from China. I know that many of the Western media tend to portray Japan as leaning to right-wing. That is not the case at all. And the fact of the matter is that we're just trying to cope with a threat. Now, as for the opposition, it is quite true that, the combination of the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan and Komeito, which was the ex-alliance partner for LDP, getting together to form a centrist reform alliance was a situation where they shot themselves in the foot, because there was no clear ideology or direction that had been depicted, and the voters basically totally lost out on the expectation of the opposition. So it's basically push and pull factor. LDP had basically gained quite substantially on back of Ms. Takaichi's popularity. She and the party fully utilized that, while the opposition shot themselves in the foot. I think that is a picture that you saw in Japan.
Dr. Takeshita, now Takaichi's government has introduced large fiscal stimulus measures and temporarily suspended the food sales tax to relieve household pressure. Even as Japan's public debt exceeds 250% of GDP and bond yields remain sensitive, is this economic intervention a necessary stabilizer during inflation and currency volatility, or does it risk postponing difficult fiscal reforms that Japan cannot avoid indefinitely?
Well, she's going for expansion of fiscal policy. And of course, there is an anxiety about the current levels of debt that Japan has. As you just noted, it is 250, 260% to GDP. But that said, I think what people tend to forget that we have substantial amount of financial assets. I mean, when you look at your own household account, do you only look at your debt? That's not the case. So if you look at the net debt to GDP, Japan's net debt to GDP is about 100 and 130%, depending on how you calculate that financial asset. So it's not something that we can sit on the couch and forget about. But at the same time, we're not in the emergency state, as was the case with Southern European nations during their financial crisis. So from that point of view, Japan still have room to basically go for very positive economic growth factor. And I think Ms. Takaichi and her regime is quite right in going for that direction, because we've seen the mistakes by ECB, where they went for austerity measures thinking that reduction of debt would basically induce growth. That is not the case. That is, in fact, the opposite of the case. So I think it's quite right that she is going for that. Of course, there is, as you point out, worries about inflation, It also worries about further weakening of the yen, which could exacerbate, the inflation. So there are worries, but we have to take some path. And one great thing about, Takaichi and her regime is she's at least showing direction in a very clear way.
Right, Dr. Now, Japanese equities have reached a record highs following the election, yet wage growth remains uneven and many households continue to feel pressure from rising food and energy costs. Are financial markets signaling confidence in Japan's direction, or is there a widening disconnect between investor optimism and lived economic reality?
I can clearly see that many people are quite anxious about, the current surge of the Japanese market, many feeling that it's overheated, and perhaps that's so if you look in ultra short term. But if you look at, from the PE point of view or, price to book point of view, it's not totally that expensive in compared to the United States or other European markets. And secondly, I think there's a very strong expectation that we will have, the economic policy putting the engine back on many of the Japanese aspects, putting a jab in the arm. Now, regarding a question about wage, that's a very good one because it's not I've always said it's not the government that induces that. It's a corporation that must do it. And knowing that the Japanese corporation has a record amount of internal assets that's been bubbling up and being kicked by many of the stakeholders, particularly the shareholders, to basically disperse that as a dividend payout or buyback, I think it's about time that the Japanese corporation really start to basically retrieving that fund back into their employees, because with the exception of last year, Japanese workers did not have any wage rise in the past 20 years, partly because we had deflation, so many people weren't complaining. But, it is really about time that I think the corporations would start to basically realize in taking risks and basically starting to invest, externally, as well as giving adequate amount of wage to their employees.
All right, sure. Now, Doctor, moving on with the two-thirds majority, Takaichi has the parliamentary numbers to initiate constitutional revision, particularly around Article 9, which renounces war. While defense spending is rising and public concern over regional security has grown, constitutional change would still require a national referendum. Is Japan politically prepared to formalize a more expansive military role, or would such a move expose deeper divisions within society?
Well, it would cause a lot of riot within Japan because Japan has been a very pacifist nation. And as you know, the Article 9 basically avoids all war to take place. But the Japanese know that even if Japan continued to have a pacifist attitude, maybe our neighboring nations don't, China or Russia. We've seen what they are doing and what they're about to do. So obviously, in order to cope with these situations, many people are saying that they should give much more breathing room, much more elbow room, much more sensible move for self-defense force to move around. And for that reason, I can see that most great majority of the Japanese will basically back up the policy of changes that are going to take place. Of course, there will be a lot of disputes because still, there are so many Japanese, in my opinion, who believe that if you are being peaceful, your neighbors will be peaceful as well. That is not the case. Look what's happening in Europe. And, from that point of view, I think many people are starting to get a wake-up call that unfortunately, we do have to basically strengthen, our defense capability. Now, many people, feel that Japan might be regressing back to the 30s. That is definitely not the case. Be it, from the ideology point of view, or be it from a military point of view, or from the economic point of view, or structural point of view, there's no way that we're regressing back to the 30s. All we're doing is basically to try to cope with the external threat that we are getting right now.
Right, Doctor, now Tokyo is deepening defense integration with Washington, and an upcoming high-level visit is expected to further align military planning in the Indo-Pacific. Amidst US-China intensifying rivalry, is Japan strengthening its alliance from strategic confidence or from concern that it has limited capacity to manage regional threats independently?
Well, basically, you say may have a limited. No, it's not. It's more than that. Without the support of the United States in our background, there'd be a lot of Chinese flags that's flinging around on the Japanese territorial islands or what have you. I have no doubt about that. And for that reason, we need to create a very strong alliance. And I think many countries, including India, is definitely feeling, those kind of threat from unitary nations like China. And for that reason, Japan has to beef up. And of course, we have to comply with a request of increasing, our military spending. But, that's up to just above 2% of GDP. And this is still extremely low in comparison to the target of 5% by the Europeans, for example. So, yes, we are going to continuously strengthen our tie to the United States as well as security measures concerned. We still have a very strong tie with China on the economic side. But we're also quite alarmed about, having excessive reliance to China on various issues, for example, like rare metal, etc., and basically to trying to remedy or rectify, our global supply chain of walking away from excessive reliance to China, along with the fact that we will be strengthening our military ties with the United States.
And relations between Tokyo and Beijing have deteriorated sharply, following tensions over Taiwan-related comments and expanded Japanese security cooperation with the US. China has responded with trade restrictions and export controls on critical materials. This framing of Taiwan contingency as a direct Japanese security issue strengthen deterrence, or does it risk locking both sides into a cycle of economic and strategic escalation?
Well, it is escalating, but the one who's really making big noise is China. All, Ms. Takaichi and her regime in Japan is saying is obvious. You have your neighbor being invaded, then you're going to basically form a survival-threatening armed attack and basically to cope with that. That is a norm of any country. And, she just answered a very normal, obvious question. China don't like it. They don't like it. So basically, they retaliate through something that is totally different. For example, halting, import of fishery goods from Japan, etc. Talking to travelers, not to go to Japan because Japan is unsafe for Chinese. Excuse me. If you look at the statistics, the amount of crimes, serious crimes to the Chinese people in Japan is decreasing every year, unlike the case in 2024 when a Japanese 10-year-old boy was slashed to death by Japan-hating Chinese and school bus being attacked. So, the fact of the matter is it's a typical Chinese methodology of retaliation when they couldn't get their voice through. It's really like a 10-year-old little brat who couldn't, have their way through, so they're going to retaliate with something else. This is a typical methodology of the Chinese way of, trying to barge their way through. This time around, I don't think this is going to happen because it is basically going to threaten our basic line of security. And we have to continuously, have a very strong ties, continuously on not only the economic side, but on military side, defense side, along with countries like Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and India, of course, and many of these, Indo-Pacific nations, which are feeling great threat from China overall.
Right. Dr. Takeshita, my final question to you before we wrap up this discussion. Japan's population is shrinking rapidly. The workforce is contracting. Social spending pressures are intensifying, even as defense budgets expand and immigration policy remains cautious. Can Japan sustain a more assertive foreign policy and higher military spending without confronting its demographic challenges and constraints more directly, or is population decline the ultimate limit on its strategic ambitions?
Well, the fact of the matter is you're right. If you look at the demographics, this is the fastest growing senior, citizen community. And, for that reason, our potential growth has always been under 2% in the past decade or so. This is a very serious problem. Labor shortage is probably one of the top two biggest problems that the Japanese industry face. And what we're trying to do is basically compromise or basically reduce this pressure through introduction of AI and various other sources of human resource saving type of investment that's very, very active in Japan right now. But for immigration side, it will take a long time, I think, although we need to acutely rectify the situation to open up. That said, we are also seeing a very big mistake of multiculturalism collapsing, the policy in Europe, especially in Western and Northern Europe. So, I can also see the Japanese authorities are being very careful about that as well. So there will be, continuous improvement that will be announced from the government as well, because that's one of the major agenda that the Japanese public wants. They want to clarify, going forward, how we are going to cope with this situation overall. And I think, again, this will be another source of very, very big debate that will be coming through.
All right, then, Dr. Seijiro Takeshita, thanks very much for sharing your insights on focal length. With that, viewers, it's a wrap on this episode of Focal Length. For more international news and updates, stay tuned to NewsX World.